My name is Madison Taylor, and 3 years ago, I believed my life was as close to perfect as anyone could hope for. I was 28, full of plans, dreams, and that soft kind of confidence that only comes when you think the world is finally on your side. I lived in a small white cottage on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of place where the mountains roll in gentle waves and the mornings smell like wet pine and coffee. My life was quiet but sweet. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of the river outside my window, its voice steady and patient, as if it had been whispering stories to the land long before I was born. I'd make coffee in my chipped blue mug and sit on the porch, waiting for the fog to lift from the hills. It was the kind of peace I used to think would last forever. At that time, I was engaged to Daniel Cooper. He was charming, handsome, and endlessly ambitious. A man with a smile that could light up a room and a voice that could make even the dullest conversation sound meaningful. We met at a charity fundraiser in Charleston, South Carolina, and I remember thinking that he seemed a little too polished for someone his age. But he looked at me like he saw something different, something worth chasing, and I was naive enough to believe that love like that couldn't possibly hide anything dark. Within 6 months, he proposed. It was a perfect evening, candlelight, soft jazz playing in the background, a ring that sparkled like the moonlight over the water. I said yes without hesitation. My parents, Linda and Richard Taylor, were overjoyed, and my sister Emma cried tears that, at the time, I thought were happy ones. We began to plan a wedding that felt like a dream. Springtime in Savannah, Georgia, under a canopy of blooming magnolias, the kind of wedding you see in magazines, but never believe could happen to you. But before the wedding, I decided to do something I'd always wanted. I took a 6-month volunteering trip to Europe, specifically to Lisbon, Portugal, where I worked at an orphanage for displaced children. I had always believed in giving back, and Daniel, ever the supportive fiancé, encouraged me to go. "You'll come back with stories," he told me, pressing a kiss to my forehead the night before I left. "And when you do, we'll start our real life together." His words filled me with warmth and hope. I had no reason to doubt them. Lisbon was everything I imagined and more: sun-soaked streets, the smell of roasted chestnuts in the air, and the music of fado spilling out from the little cafes that lined the cobbled alleys. The orphanage where I worked was small but full of life. The children, though poor, had spirits brighter than the Atlantic sun. I spent my mornings teaching English and my afternoons painting murals with them on the crumbling walls. I sent photos and letters home every week. My parents always replied with polite enthusiasm. Daniel's letters, though, were what I lived for. Each one began with "My dearest Maddie" and ended with "Forever yours, Daniel." They were filled with stories about the house he was renovating for us, about the business he was expanding, about how he missed the way I made coffee. He told me he couldn't wait to see me walk down the aisle. I carried those letters with me everywhere, tied together with a ribbon in my suitcase. But as the weeks passed, something began to feel off. His replies grew shorter, less detailed, and more formal. He stopped calling as often, saying he was busy closing deals or traveling for work. I told myself not to worry. After all, life went on even when you were in love. Still, sometimes at night, as I watched the lights of Lisbon flicker across the Tagus River, I'd feel a small unease curling in my stomach. It was the kind of feeling you can't quite name, a whisper that something is shifting beneath the surface, waiting to break. Then came the message that changed everything. It was a quiet Sunday evening in late March. I had just come back from a long day at the orphanage and was sitting by the window, sipping tea and writing in my journal. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft orange glow over the rooftops. My phone buzzed, a message from my mother. It said, "Don't rush home. Your sister Emma has married Daniel. We'll explain later." I read it once, then again, convinced it was some kind of mistake. My heart began to race. Married? My sister? My fiancé? I laughed out loud at first, a short, sharp laugh that sounded nothing like joy. Then slowly the meaning settled in. The letters, the silence, the missing warmth, it all made a terrible kind of sense. My mother didn't answer when I called. Neither did Daniel. Emma, the sister who used to braid my hair and borrow my sweaters without asking, didn't reply either. I sat there for hours, staring out the window, the city lights blurring through my tears. For the next few days, I walked through Lisbon like a ghost. The children asked why I wasn't smiling anymore. I told them I was just tired, but inside I was unraveling. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to home, to the people who had betrayed me. The betrayal itself was bad enough, but what cut deeper was my parents' silence. They had always favored Emma, the younger, prettier one. But I never imagined they would bless her marrying the man I loved. Eventually, one of the other volunteers, a kind woman named Clara, noticed something was wrong. I told her everything, and she just shook her head. "You can't fix people like that, Madison," she said gently. "Some things you just have to let burn." Her words sank into me like a stone dropped into deep water. I realized that I couldn't go back, not yet. Not until I had gathered the strength to face them. I extended my stay for another month, trying to lose myself in work, trying to heal through kindness. Every morning I woke before dawn and watched the city come alive, hoping that the sunlight would somehow erase the shadow of what had happened. It didn't, but it taught me something, that the world doesn't stop turning for your heartbreak. The river still flows. The children still laugh. Life still goes on even when yours feels shattered. By the time I finally packed my bags to return to America, I wasn't the same woman who had left 6 months earlier. The girl who believed in perfect love had died somewhere on those Lisbon streets, replaced by someone quieter, sharper, and less trusting. I didn't know what awaited me at home, only that I had to see it for myself. When the plane lifted off from Lisbon, I looked down at the city one last time. I thought about Daniel's promises, my sister's smile, my parents' silence, all the things I'd once called love. Somewhere inside me, beneath the pain, a voice whispered, "This is not the end, Madison. This is where your real story begins." When I came back to America, it felt like I was walking through a fog I couldn't shake. The flight from Lisbon to New York City had been long and restless. I remember staring out the airplane window as the coastline appeared beneath the clouds, and instead of excitement, all I felt was dread. The country that had always been home now felt foreign, almost hostile. Everything in me wanted to believe there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that maybe my mother's message had been worded wrong, that maybe it wasn't the betrayal I feared, but deep down I already knew the truth. You can sense when something inside your world has shifted beyond repair. I took a train from New York to Richmond, Virginia, because that's where my family lived. The house was the same as I'd left it, pale blue paint, white shutters, and roses growing along the porch railing. I had planted those roses with my mother years ago, one summer when she still smiled at me the way mothers should. The sight of them used to make me feel safe. But that day I couldn't even bring myself to touch them. It was strange how something as beautiful as a flower could suddenly feel like a warning. I walked up the steps with my suitcase dragging behind me and rang the bell. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from something colder, anticipation, maybe, or anger trying to disguise itself as calm. When the door opened, I froze. It was Emma, my younger sister. My best friend once upon a time. She stood there wearing my wedding dress, the same one I had chosen in Charleston after trying on half a dozen others. The ivory silk, the lace sleeves, the way the neckline dipped just enough to be elegant, but not bold. It was all mine. I remember how my mother had cried when I first showed it to her, saying I looked like an angel. Now, that same dress clung to Emma's body, and she looked nothing like an angel. She looked triumphant. "Madison," she said brightly, spinning around as though modeling it for me. "You're home. Do you like it?" It fit me perfectly. Behind her, Daniel appeared. He was wearing a gray suit, holding a glass of champagne, smiling like the world had given him everything he'd ever wanted. "Maddie," he said, his voice light but uneasy, "it's been a long time." I stared at them both, silent for a moment, then laughed. I didn't mean to, it just escaped. A sharp, uncontrollable laugh that echoed through the hall. My parents came out from the living room, my mother clutching a pearl necklace at her throat, my father with that look of calm authority he always wore when trying to make things seem reasonable. "Madison, sweetheart," my mother began, "please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Things have changed. Emma and Daniel, they fell in love while you were away. You were gone for so long, and you have such a good heart. You'll understand one day." "Understand?" I said, my voice trembling now. You mean you all agreed to this? You thought it was fine that my sister married my fiancé, my dress? My father sighed, as if I were being dramatic. Daniel is a good man, Maddie. He takes care of your sister. He's built a life here. You were off chasing causes in Europe. We thought maybe you'd moved on. I remember standing there, feeling my knees weaken. They weren't just defending it, they were proud of it. The people who raised me, who taught me about honesty and love, were now treating betrayal like a business decision. But what struck me most wasn't even their words. It was Daniel's eyes. He couldn't meet mine for more than a few seconds. There was guilt there, yes, but also fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing your lies are starting to crumble. I didn't say another word. I turned around, walked out of the house, and kept walking until I reached the corner of the street. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone twice trying to call a cab. When I finally got into one, the driver asked where I was headed. I said, anywhere but here. Over the next few days, I stayed in a cheap motel near downtown Richmond. The room smelled of old carpet and lemon cleaner, but it was quiet, and I needed that. I barely slept. My mind replayed everything: Daniel's smile, Emma's voice, my parents' calm explanations. It was like reliving a nightmare in slow motion. I wrote Daniel an email asking for answers. He replied with a single sentence: I didn't mean for things to happen this way. No apology, no explanation. Just cowardice. Then, about a month later, I found out the truth. I had gone to a small cafe one morning to clear my head, and while scrolling through the news on my phone, I saw his name, Daniel Cooper, in an article headline, Virginia businessman, under investigation for fraudulent investment schemes. The words didn't make sense at first. But as I read on, my stomach dropped. Daniel had been running fake investment accounts, scamming families across Boston, Chicago, and parts of Philadelphia. He wasn't wealthy, he was stealing. The cars, the house, the donations he made in his name, it was all other people's money. He had used Emma's name to open one of the accounts. That detail made my blood run cold. My sister, the one who betrayed me, had unknowingly tied herself to his crimes. I wanted to feel vindicated, but I didn't. I felt sick. I had once loved this man. I had dreamed of building a life with him. Now I realized he had never truly loved anyone but himself. I went to see Emma that evening. She looked thinner, paler, and her confidence had cracked. Madison, she whispered when she opened the door. You knew? I nodded. He's been lying to you, to all of us. He's a thief. She sank to the floor and began to cry, and for a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the look on her face when she'd spun in my wedding dress, proud and glowing. I couldn't comfort her. Not this time. Within a week, Daniel vanished. The authorities said he had likely fled the state. My parents tried to call me again, saying they were sorry, saying they hadn't known. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. Some betrayals are too deep to patch over with apologies. I spent that summer rebuilding myself. I sold my engagement ring for $1,200 and used the money to move into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much: one bedroom, one window, one fragile hope, but it was mine. I started working part-time at a community center, helping people who had lost everything. Maybe I saw a bit of myself in them. Every night, before going to bed, I'd think of that day in Richmond, the pale blue house, the roses, the laughter that wasn't joy. And though it still hurt, I began to understand something. Sometimes the truth doesn't save you. It frees you. Daniel was gone, Emma was broken, and my parents were left with their guilt. And me, I was learning how to live again. After the truth came out, it was like the entire foundation of my life had been blown apart. The newspapers printed Daniel's name for weeks. Conmen on the run, investors deceived by charming businessman, Virginia couple implicated in fraud. Every headline felt like a bruise I hadn't asked for. My parents tried calling, sending messages that said things like, "We didn't know," "Sweetheart," and then, "Please come home, we miss you." But home wasn't a place anymore. It was just a collection of walls filled with lies. Emma, my sister, was humiliated. She refused to leave the house for months, ashamed of what people said behind her back. I didn't take any pleasure in her pain, but I couldn't bring myself to forgive her either. Forgiveness requires trust, and I had nothing left to give her. Daniel, of course, disappeared completely. The police said he might have fled the country, maybe to Europe, using a fake passport. The irony wasn't lost on me. He might have been walking the same cobblestone streets I once did in Lisbon. I couldn't bear the thought. So I packed what little I had: 2 suitcases, my camera, and a few $100s in savings. When I sold my engagement ring and some jewelry I no longer cared for, I ended up with just under $2,000. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a one-way ticket to somewhere new. I wanted a city far enough away to breathe, but not so far that I felt like I was running from my own shadow. That's how I chose Denver, Colorado. I'd never been there before, but when I saw photos of the mountains surrounding the city, something in me whispered, "Start here." I found a small apartment above a bakery in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. It wasn't much: 1 bedroom, creaky floors, and a tiny balcony that looked out over the rooftops. But I loved it instantly. Every morning the smell of freshly baked bread drifted up through my window, and it felt like a small reminder that good things could still rise from the heat. I got a job at a community counseling center, helping people find jobs, apply for housing, and navigate through difficult times. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was modest, about $18 an hour, but the work gave me something my old life never did: purpose. The first few months were lonely. I didn't know anyone in Denver, and I wasn't ready to tell strangers the full story of why I'd left Virginia. When people asked, I simply said I needed a change. Most accepted that without question. It was a relief to be around people who didn't know my family, who didn't whisper when I entered a room, who didn't look at me with pity or curiosity. Then came Lovra Bennett, a woman I met at the counseling center. She was a client at first, a single mother trying to get back on her feet after leaving an abusive marriage. She had a son named Owen who was 6 and loved drawing dinosaurs on everything, including my desk. Lavra had a quick wit and a kind heart, and soon we became friends. We'd sit together after work at a little cafe on Colfax Avenue, drinking coffee and trading stories. She had a way of making even the darkest moments sound survivable. One evening she said to me, "You've been through something, haven't you?" I hesitated, but she didn't press. "I can tell," she continued softly. "You have that look, like you've lost something important, but you're still standing." Her words caught me off guard. No one had ever said it like that before. I smiled and nodded, feeling both seen and safe. From that day on, Lavra became like a sister to me, the kind I wished Emma had been. Through her, I met Ethan Cole, a quiet journalist who occasionally volunteered at the center. He was in his mid-30s, thoughtful, with that calm kind of confidence that doesn't demand attention. We met one afternoon while organizing donation boxes, and he struck up a conversation about books. He had this habit of looking you in the eye when he listened, not to judge, but to truly understand. We started talking more after work, sometimes over coffee, sometimes over nothing but silence and shared company. He never asked about my past, and I never offered it. Somehow, he understood that I needed space more than sympathy. That was what drew me to him, his patience. It reminded me that not everyone wanted something from me. Some people just wanted to sit beside you until you remembered how to breathe again. By autumn, Denver had started to feel like home. I got used to the rhythm of the city, the buzz of the streetcars, the golden leaves scattered across the sidewalks, the way the air turned crisp in the evenings. Every Friday night, after work, I'd sit on my little balcony with a cup of tea and watch the city lights stretch toward the mountains. It became my ritual, my quiet conversation with the universe. Sometimes I'd think about my family, about Emma and my parents, and wonder if they ever thought about me. They called every now and then, asking if I was ready to talk. I always told them the same thing: not yet. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a single moment. It was a long, winding process, like walking a road you're not sure will ever end. And maybe for now it didn't need to. Some wounds don't need to be healed right away. Some simply need to be acknowledged. I started saving a little money each month, tucking away $20 or $30 whenever I could. It wasn't much, but it was enough to dream. I imagined buying a small car, maybe traveling to the mountains on weekends, or even opening a small art studio someday. For the first time in years, my dreams weren't tied to someone else's name or approval. They were mine alone. Sometimes when I walked through the city, I'd see couples holding hands, laughing, planning futures together. I didn't feel jealous anymore, just curious. I wondered if love could ever come back to me, not as something reckless or blinding, but gentle, steady, like a sunrise after a storm. One night, as I was closing the counseling office, Ethan stopped by with 2 cups of coffee. "You look tired," he said. "You should see the mountains this weekend. They're covered in snow already." I smiled. "Maybe I will." "Good," he said, handing me a cup. Everyone deserves to start over somewhere. After he left, I stood by the window, watching the snowfall begin outside. For the first time in a long time, I felt something soft bloom inside me. Not love, not yet, but something close to hope. And that, I realized, was enough. Denver had become my city of second chances. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had built a life out of pieces, small, imperfect, but mine. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of happiness I had been chasing all along. 2 years had passed since I first stepped off that bus in Denver with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like shattered glass. Time, I had learned, doesn't fix everything, but it softens the edges. It takes the sharpness of grief and rounds it into something bearable, something that no longer cuts every time you remember. By the time I turned 31, the city that had once felt like a place to hide had become my home. I knew the rhythm of its mornings, the calm of its evenings, and the quiet way the mountains changed color with the seasons. Life had taken on a gentle simplicity. I woke early, brewed coffee in my small kitchen, and watched the sunlight crawl across the floorboards. My job at the counseling center had grown into more than work. It had become a calling. People trusted me with their stories of heartbreak, loss, mistakes, and resilience. Sometimes, while listening to them, I'd recognize pieces of myself in their pain. I'd tell them what I had once needed to hear. That starting over doesn't mean you failed. It means you survived. By then, I had saved enough to leave my little apartment above the bakery and buy a small house just outside Aurora, about 30 minutes from downtown Denver. It wasn't much, pale yellow with green shutters and a garden that needed work, but it was mine. I paid $147,000 for it, every dollar carefully earned. The first night I slept there, I sat on the porch steps under a blanket, sipping tea and staring at the open sky. For the first time in a long time, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, the kind that comes when you realize you don't need anyone else to make your life whole. The neighborhood was quiet, full of families and older couples who greeted me on their evening walks. The woman next door, Mrs. Howard, was in her 60s and had a laugh that could fill an entire street. She grew sunflowers along our shared fence and often handed me loaves of banana bread. Just because, on weekends, I'd invite Lavra and her son Owen over for lunch. He was taller now, always talking about dinosaurs and space, and sometimes he'd help me plant flowers in my backyard. It felt like healing, slow, honest, and real. Then, one chilly evening in late November, everything came full circle. I stopped by a small grocery store after work, picking up milk, bread, and a few candles for the house. As I waited in line, my eyes drifted to the newspaper stand near the register. A headline in bold letters caught my attention. "Conman arrested in Seattle, millions stolen through fake charities." For a moment, the world around me went quiet. I reached for the paper with trembling hands, and there it was, his face. Daniel Cooper. The same smile, the same dark eyes, though older now, harder, emptier. According to the article, he had been living under a different name for the past year, running fraudulent charitable foundations across several states. He'd finally been caught trying to flee to Canada with over $500,000 in cash. I read the words slowly, letting them sink in, and then, to my surprise, I laughed. Not out of joy, not out of spite, but out of relief. It felt like an old wound finally closing. I folded the newspaper, placed it back on the stand, and paid for my groceries. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea, the cold air brushing against my skin. The stars were bright, the kind of bright you only see away from the noise of the city. And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Daniel, not at Emma, not even at my parents. Anger had once been the only thing keeping me standing, but now it felt heavy, unnecessary, like a coat I didn't need anymore. I had carried it long enough. A week later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Emma. Her letter was short, written in careful, almost hesitant words. She told me she had left Daniel months before his arrest. She had moved to Nashville, Tennessee, working at a flower shop and trying to rebuild her life. She apologized, not the shallow, rehearsed kind of apology I'd heard before, but a genuine one. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, only that she hoped I was happy. I read the letter 3 times, then placed it in a drawer. I didn't write back. I wasn't sure if I ever would. Forgiveness doesn't always need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes it's just a quiet decision to stop carrying the weight of what someone did to you. My parents called again that Christmas. My mother's voice was softer this time, full of something I hadn't heard before: regret. She said they missed me, that they were sorry for everything, that they wished they'd protected me instead of hurting me. I listened in silence. When she asked if I'd come visit, I told her maybe one day. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't a promise either. Winter turned to spring and life continued. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before Lisbon. My living room walls soon filled with soft colors, blues, greens, and golds, like pieces of peace made visible. Ethan still volunteered at the center, and sometimes he'd stop by for dinner. We'd talk about books, travel, and the small things that made life beautiful. He never pushed for more than friendship, though sometimes I wondered if there could be something deeper between us. But I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time, I was content just being me. One Sunday morning, I went to the farmer's market downtown. A young woman there was selling handmade dresses, and one of them caught my eye: white, simple, and elegant. For a second, I thought of my old wedding dress, the one Emma had worn. The memory didn't sting anymore. Instead, I felt a strange gratitude. That dress had belonged to another version of me, a woman who believed her worth was tied to someone else's love. The woman I had become no longer needed a dress, or a man, or a family's approval to feel complete. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, I sat on my porch, barefoot, watching the sky turn gold and violet. The house around me was quiet, filled with the soft hum of a life I had built from scratch. I thought about how far I had come, from the girl who lost everything to the woman who found herself again. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and whispered into the dusk, "I made it." Sometimes I still dream about the wedding dress, though now it's more like a symbol than a scar. It reminds me that I once thought love was about grand gestures and promises. But real love, the kind that lasts, begins within yourself. The life I wear now, stitched together with mistakes, courage, and forgiveness, fits me better than any silk ever could.